Well, good evening, everyone. We will go ahead and begin. Glad that everyone is here, and just make an announcement that if you would like, you can get some appetizers, finger food, some tea, coffee, water, little treats, and some refreshments before we begin. If you want to take an opportunity, if you've not already done so, to do that. Also, if you need to use the restroom is in the foyer to the left. There's a door going downstairs. You'll go downstairs, and then immediately to your left, there are two restrooms, the women and men, and feel free to use the restroom. And also, if you're uncomfortable at any point due to being too warm or too cold, just let me know, and we'll be happy to adjust the thermostat. I bumped it down pretty low because I knew it was a hot afternoon, and I wanted to be prepared for all the people. So anyway, if you're uncomfortable at any point, please let us know, because sometimes it's hard to pay attention and hard to enjoy the conversation whenever you're uncomfortable. But welcome. We are glad that you're here. And we are not live streaming this evening, but we are recording. And so this will be edited and then be available, hopefully posted on our YouTube channel and also on the website by the end of the week. And this is the first of a three-part series entitled, We Are Still Here, An Indigenous History of the United States. And I'll share with you in just a moment what we'll cover each of those three lecture series. We have 2 hours per Wednesday, beginning now through the 28th of August, scheduled. We may not go the full 2 hours. I'll try to keep you no later than those 2 hours, but we have a lot of material to cover, and I do not want to shortchange the opportunity that you have to have discussion, to answer questions, and to have dialogue about what I present. So just as a rule of thumb, what I'll try to do is present for the first hour, maybe hour and 15, then we'll give you a little break, and then we'll come back and have some discussion. So I'm sure that as I present, there will be a lot of questions, and I encourage you to think of questions to ask, but if you can, please hold on to them until the presentation is over each evening, so that we can make sure that we get through all the material. And it's possible that your question might be answered in the course of the presentation itself. But if not, please be brave and ask your question. There is no question that we will not entertain, so feel free to ask whatever is on your heart and mind. Okay, that being said, most of you know this, but my name is Greg Bainey. I'm the pastor here of Woodlands Gathering, and it's our vision to be a safe place for Native Americans and all people to encounter the good news of God. And as we journey together over the next 3 weeks through this lecture series, hopefully it will become a little clearer to each of us what that means historically, as well as in the contemporary time that we find ourselves. But before I get too far, let me open us in a word of prayer, if I may. Let us pray. Our Father in heaven, we give you thanks and praise for this evening. We thank you for those who are here. Thank you for those who have set aside the time to join us this evening and to be part of this dialogue, this discussion. And we pray for those who might listen and tune in online in the days and weeks and years ahead, that you would just use this information, that it wouldn't simply be information that unsettles us or discomforts us, but that it would be information ultimately that transforms us, that gives us a foundation, a path forward towards building a world that we can all thrive and be at peace and harmony in. We thank you for the work that you're doing through Christ, and it's in his name that we ask this. Amen. Okay, well, again, welcome. This is the first of a three-part lecture series entitled We Are Still Here. Let's briefly, I want to just share a little bit about myself, and then also to give a preview of some things to come. So this series seeks to explore the history of the United States and its relationship with indigenous peoples in general, as well as the specific role of the Euro-Christian settlers in particular. And if at any time you cannot see, please feel free to move about so that you can see the presentation better. The objective is to encourage steps towards reparative justice through understanding. And if that term reparative justice is new for you, that's okay. I'm sure it's new for a lot of people. We'll spend a lot of time talking about it the third week, so we'll not really talk about it tonight. I do want to give you a forecast of what's to come, so that's one reason why I share that. But we'll talk a great deal about what that looks like and what it means in our third lecture. So looking forward, this gives you an idea of where we're going, an outline of the 3 weeks. Today, August the 14th, we're going to look at from Cahokia to colonization. And if you've never heard of Cahokia before, you're in the right place. You're going to learn of what Cahokia is about. We're actually going to go a little pre-Cahokia, and I'll share with you some of the information that has been passed down just intertribally from the elders of a time that is remembered, but not necessarily documented in the way that many people in the Western world document things. So tonight we'll look at the time period from Cahokia, or just prior to Cahokia, to colonization. And then on August the 21st, next Wednesday, we'll look at the time period from assimilation to attempted annihilation. And just to give you an idea, from Cahokia to colonization, we'll briefly talk about things that happened in 2500 BC, but then quickly speed up to around 1000 AD. And so that's really where we begin tonight, is 1000 AD up until 1492. Well, actually, tonight we'll end at around the end of the 1700s, the end of the 18th century. So we're going to cover a lot of territory, and hopefully it'll be something that is not only enlightening, but also something you can reflect on. And again, if once we post the information online, you can go back and listen to it again and watch the recording and reflect on it and think about it even after tonight's lecture. Then from assimilation to attempted annihilation, that time period basically is from 1820 through 1890. So even though it's a shorter period of time, there's still a lot of information that we're going to cover that week. Come on in, guys. We're just now getting started, so feel free to find a seat. Make sure it's somewhere in the center or maybe over to the side so that you can see the screen. And also feel free to get you an appetizer or a cold drink if you need it. Then the third week, which is the title is From Ashes to Resurgence, we'll go from the time period of roughly 1908, 1906, around the Dawes Commission, if you're familiar with that. If not, hopefully you will be by the end of the lecture series, up until today. So we're going to cover a pretty large range of history from roughly 2500 BC all the way up to today. And then also the third week of the lecture, we're going to talk about reparative justice, what it is, what it isn't, and what the implications are for us as a church. Okay, so one of the objectives in the lecture series is to provide an indigenous perspective of the history of what is now known as the United States. Now, I'll admit that this series does not claim to be representative of all indigenous peoples. That claim would be impossible and difficult to substantiate. Indigenous people in North America alone are very diverse and have a variety of different perspectives. Rather, it is an attempt to tell the story of the United States through the lens of a shared experience in an effort to better understand today's indigenous peoples. Just to give you a little time and place about my own personal story and why I feel somewhat qualified to speak to this. I come from like many of you, I come from a mixed ancestry, both that of a settler background as well as a native background. My own personal story, I'm a second-generation believer, meaning that my mom and her generation was the first to put their faith in Christ, so far as we can tell, in generations, preceding generations at least. And I knew I was native from a very young age, and have been on a journey, a lifelong journey, as many native people have, and mixed or not, to discover exactly what that means. And then I felt a sense of call to Native America, both as a people group, as well as eventually planting Woodlands Gathering, this church that you're sitting in, from a very young age. This beautiful young lady to my right is my paternal grandmother. She's full Native. Her name was Alfreda Fennell, and she passed away back in 2016. But this is one of the reasons that I feel somewhat qualified. Her own story, which lives on in me, and of course in my children and my cousins and so on, is one reason why I think Of course, all of us have the right to have this conversation because we're all here in the same place, in the same context, but I think it's helpful to give some context as to my background and my story and exactly why this is meaningful to me and where I'm coming from whenever I speak into these issues. Okay, so the land that we are currently on, of course, we refer to it as the United States of America, North America. Most of the more than 575 tribes who reside in this land had a term for this country that equates to something similar to Turtle Island. Now, there's a reason for the name Turtle Island, which I'll not go into this evening. But in essence, the relationship between Native peoples and this landmass, it not only can you look at the map and draw a parallel to the turtle. If you look at Central and Central America, it kind of is the turtle's tail. If you look at the central part of the mainland continent of North America, it's the body of the turtle. And so as a landmass itself, there's some similarities with it being Turtle Island. But for the most part, Native people have referred to this landmass as Turtle Island due to various stories. I know in my particular tradition, the Chickamauga Cherokee tradition, there's a story of Doxy, the terrapin, and there's also a story of Grandmother Turtle. Grandmother Turtle is one that has a meaningful role to play in the expansion of this landmass. So in pre-Columbian America, tribes had no concept of a nation. So the idea that this landmass is a nation is really a Western idea, a Western concept. It's not something that originated in North America. Rather, each village was considered sovereign, at least in the contemporary understanding of the word. So sovereignty was not even something that existed. The notion of sovereignty really didn't exist in native North America because you can't have sovereignty without a sovereign. Think of it. And what's a sovereign? A sovereign typically is a king, a monarch. And so if you do not have a sovereign, and if we look at the history of Western Europe, one thing that we see is this battle really that culminated in the Magna Carta, and if you don't know what that is, we'll not take time tonight to define it, but really the tension between who owns the land. Is it the king, the divine right of kings, or is it the people? And one of the revolutionary concepts that came out of the Enlightenment in the 15th and 16th centuries was the notion that the people were sovereign, which led to the idea of a state or of a nation, which was then imported to the United States via colonial settlers. So the concept of sovereign or of a nation really didn't exist in pre-Columbian America. And also, there was no concept of private land ownership. The notion that you could own a piece of turf or a piece of land was considered absurd to many indigenous people and still is to some extent. There were definitely boundaries of hunting territories, boundaries of villages, but those villages were not owned by individuals, they were owned by the community proper. And so when we get to the third lecture, and the third lecture in our series, one thing that we'll see is that the United States picked up on this and actually through the Dawes Commission and a few other acts of government made it to where they took away the notion of communal land ownership and really tried to incentivize this belief or this notion of private land ownership. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now we're still way back in pre-Columbian America, and in pre-Columbian America the notion of sovereignty really didn't exist, nor did private land ownership. Okay, the early indigenous society was characterized by the harmony virtue. In my own tribal tradition, the term for this is elahe, which is a term that describes harmony. We have this same term in Hebrew. In the Hebrew Bible, this term shalom, which is not just the absence of peace or of war, but rather it is a comprehensive peace. A means of thriving. It's not just the absence of conflict or the absence of suffering, but it is a comprehensive harmony and a comprehensive state of thriving. So for Native people prior in pre-Columbian times, harmony was a tribal virtue. Land was not something that you live on, but rather that you live with. And there's a big distinction there because the land is not dead. And, it would take centuries of scientific inquiries to finally reach the conclusion that many of our North American indigenous people have known all along, which is that this earth is actually alive. If you were to pick up a handful of soil and look at it under a microscope, you would see more living microorganisms in a handful of soil than you could possibly fathom. So the earth that we walk on is literally alive. And of course, one way that we can prove that is if you ever take a piece of wood that has been cut down from a tree and you stick it in the soil for any length of time, guess what happens to the wood? It begins to disintegrate, begins to become earth once again. Why? Because there are living organisms that are literally eating away at that wood, that are decomposing it, using it for furtherance of life. So land is not something that you live on, but it's something that you live with, and an intricate system of roads. And this is something that really many historians, many anthropologists were unwilling to consider up until contemporary times, the belief that there's this massive network of roads, of communities, all the way from the eastern seaboard to the great southwest and the western coast on what is now the Pacific Ocean, called the Pacific Ocean. There were an intricate connection of pathways that connected people to one another. What are some of the values of pre-Columbian North America? And to some extent, these values persist even today in traditional tribal communities. Well, as you would imagine, they were community-oriented. So the notion of individualism was not common among indigenous North Americans. They were creation-oriented. Meaning that, again, to live at peace and harmony and to consider all things well wasn't just all things are well for me individually. If all things weren't well for my community, then all things weren't well. If all things weren't well for the land that we live with, then all things were not well. And so there's definitely a creation orientation as well as a holistic worldview or a holistic approach. Again, I compare it to the Hebrew concept of shalom, which is not simply the absence of conflict, but it's a holistic, comprehensive notion that everything is at peace and harmony and everything is thriving in a very complementary way. Native America is very story-oriented, even today. I could tell many stories about why this land is known as Turtle Island. The way that Native people generally teach historically in a traditional way was through the telling of stories. Children were taught right from wrong. They were taught a morality using stories. Relational responsibility was something that was considered of high importance. So you always considered yourself in relationship to the community. And I will say that whenever some of the early missionaries came to some of the traditional tribal villages, that one of the obstacles that some of the missionaries had when introducing Christ and Scripture to Native people was their emphasis, the emphasis of the missionary, that is, on individual sin. And to a traditional Native person in North America, an individual sin was not the highest kind of sin. The most grievous kind of sin was a sin against the community, one that involved the community. So you can see there how that the value of North America was definitely more relational, more communally oriented, and the whole idea. In fact, if you wanted to be someone that was called a witch, in traditional tribal communities, a witch was someone who tried to exert themselves over others and tried to use their influence to control others. And so you see that sort of as a ethos or as a value all throughout Native culture in pre-Columbian times. Also, Native people are and were more past-present oriented instead of future-oriented. Now, contrast that with, the notion of the Enlightenment. If you're familiar with history, you know that the Enlightenment was a period in Western Europe where people began to look beyond their own country, beyond their own empire, beyond their own city or village where they live, and they began to think and dream about what lie beyond the sea, what lay even up, among the stars. And so we might argue that began the race that eventually led to space in the 20th century because of people's constant pressing on to the future and looking to the future. The harmony ethic is the prevailing ethos of the community, and most all Native North American communities, to my knowledge, were egalitarian. They were not hierarchical. So again, you cannot have a hierarchy if you have the absence of a sovereign. So earlier we talked about sovereignty and the notion of sovereignty, the concept of sovereignty, that there's a king and that there's a lord and that there's a fiefdom, there's fiefs and there's knights and then there's peasants. And the lords were the ones who owned the land, and we're talking specifically about medieval Europe, about medieval England, if you remember from history. But the lords were the ones who owned the land, and all the people who worked for them were basically the disposable ones. They were the insignificant ones. And then the lords, of course, were the ones that made sure that they were popular with the king, because generally that's how they became lords, by finding favor with the king. So that whole structure of hierarchy was not something that existed, to our knowledge, in pre-Columbian North America. Rather, it was an egalitarian culture, an egalitarian society. Okay, the first thing to note about the early Native American roads is they were not just trails. This is a quote from David Wade Chambers, and it's goes back to something I mentioned earlier. They were not just trails used for hunting. Rather, they constituted an extensive system of roadways that spanned the Americas, making possible short, medium, and long-distance travel. And so one thing that we see is that there's actually a pathway, even from South America all the way up along the Mississippi, and we're going to talk about Cahokia in just a moment. But one thing that historians have now come to realize is that there was an intricate system of city-states, if you will, all along the Mississippian coast, the Mississippi, what is now the Mississippi River, and they were connected by this very complex system of roads from northern Illinois, what is now northern Illinois, all the way down to what is now Louisiana, the state of Louisiana. So let's briefly talk about early indigenous society. Corn, beans, and squash were staple crops grown extensively throughout both North and South America, as well as deer, elk, and bison, and fresh fish was plentiful. So the diet of native North Americans was primarily protein and vegetables. Some people say, well, wait a minute, what about carbohydrates? Well, believe it or not, apart from the carbohydrates that occur in things like corn and potatoes and tomatoes and things such as that, many of the carbohydrates were imported. So the only type of bread that is truly indigenous to North America is bread that's made out of cornmeal. Flour, wheat, that's not something that is indigenous to North America. Rather, it was brought here from Europe. Sugar is something. I know that the sugar plantations became an issue, especially in colonial America. It was one reason for the importation of slaves. But sugar is not a crop that is indigenous to North America. It was actually indigenous to parts of the West Indies and Papua New Guinea. And then it was found that it would grow and flourish in places like the Southeast, as well as in the central South America and the Caribbean. And so it was imported, or it was an imported crop that became rather plentiful in order to, keep the king's tea suite in London. So deer, elk, bison, as well as corn, beans, and squash, and a variety of other fresh fruits and vegetables were plentiful. Trade in beads, furs, and pottery was very lucrative. In fact, whenever archaeologists have excavated places like Cahokia, they find seashells, that abalone shells, even as early as the 1st and 2nd century A.D. They find these shells that had to have been imported from a trade with the far west, with the western coast. Trade in beads, furs, pottery was lucrative. Clothing was made from cotton and animal skins. A lot of people think that native North Americans walked around naked. That's not true. Yes, during the summer, there may have been very reasonable clothing that was worn due to the heat, especially in the southeast. But cotton clothing was just as common in native North America prior to 1492 as any other type of clothing. In fact, it was more common than buckskin and than deer. Deer became and buckskin became common later during the time when cotton, native-grown cotton varieties in North America became rare because of the way that they were exploited and grown in the South. And according to historians and archaeologists, as well as tribal peoples themselves, disease, it still persisted, but in essence, it was not on the same level as in Western Europe. And the reason why, and I've been told this by several tribal elders, both within my own community as well as other tribal communities, that every disease known to native North American people prior to 1492, there was a plant that was also known to treat that disease. One reason why that smallpox and diphtheria and typhoid fever and a lot of the other diseases that wiped out so many large populations of native North Americans, one reason why that the bubonic plague and others, one reason why that they were so deadly is because they were outside, they originated outside of North America, and there was no known cure, no known plant in order to treat them. And so even up until the 20th century, tuberculosis, my grandmother that you saw in the picture, she was in a sanatorium when my father was born because she had tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is something that even as recent as the mid-20th century was a pandemic among Native Americans. All right, so let's talk briefly about the early indigenous society. What did it look like? What was the structure of it? Houses were made from local material. So a lot of times when people think of native North Americans, the first thing they picture is a teepee. Well, that would have been appropriate if you were in the Great Plains, but it was not the housing of choice in the Southeast, mainly because teepees are good for nomadic peoples, but they're not good for people who pretty much have rotational villages that are lived in all summer or all spring, or villages that are lived in all winter, or in some cases, villages that are lived in year-round. So if you're living in a village year-round, you want something a little more permanent than a teepee. And you look around and you realize, well, there are buffalo. Please, there are American bison in the Southeast. Don't misunderstand. But they're not as plentiful in the Southeast prior to the time of Christopher Columbus and the early settlers as they were in the Great Plains of the upper Northwest. So what you see is that among indigenous populations, houses reflected the local building materials. So for the Cherokee people, they usually had houses made of wattle and daub construction. This is a picture here of what a winter house made of wattle and daub might look like. A summer house would probably be very similar, except it would be more open on the sides. There wouldn't be the wattle and daub would come maybe halfway up, and then the upper part of it would be completely open so that it would allow the breeze to come through. So there would be a separate house for the winter and a separate house for the summer. And the elements that were common in nature around where people lived and resided were used in the creation of these homes. Also, one other aspect of a pre-Columbian society is that consensus, and this is still the case by and large, at least among traditional people, consensus was the means of decision-making. You know, in the United States, we say 51% rules, right? Majority rules. Well, that may be a good way of winning a political battle, but it's not a good way of keeping people happy and in harmony with each other. And if harmony is what you're trying to achieve, then at the end of the day, what you really want is consensus. And so, believe it or not, I know I'll speak from my own tribe and among the Chickamauga Cherokee and the traditional Cherokee people. Whenever a council was called, sometimes they would discuss one issue for days on end until there could be a consensus reached. Everyone, not majority rules, but a uniformity of consensus, a consensus among all the people to where they reached a decision that was in the best interest of all. So what are some of the major metropolitan areas? So I said that, and by the way, let me just ask a question, and it's always good. If you've heard me ask this question before, please don't answer. But it's always good to get an idea of where people are in their knowledge of Native history prior to 1492. What was the general estimate, a conservative estimate, for the population in native North America prior to 1492? Anyone want to throw out an answer? A conservative estimate of, you've probably heard me say, but go ahead, Mikal. Okay, 12 million. Okay. Well informed, yes. Anyone else want to throw out a number? We have 12, we have 20 to 90. 150, okay. Chris? Okay, so roughly 10 billion people, or well, how many people in the U.S.? 10 billion people? Yeah. All right. That's 10 billion in the world, not in the U.S. Yeah, that's right. Well, according to conservative estimates, there were at least 60 million people living in North America in 1491. The liberal estimate, meaning that, there's some likelihood that it's wrong, is 120 million. So anywhere between 60 million and 120 million people are estimated to have lived in North America in 1491. Now, does anyone want to take a guess at how many native people lived in North America in 1891, 400 years afterwards? 250,000. So if we're going to take the conservative estimate of 60 million, then in a 400-year period, how do we go from being a thriving country of more than 60 million people down to 250,000? Well, that's the history that you're about to be introduced to. It's the history of indigenous North America. And it's not history that I was ever taught in school, and I guarantee you it's not history that you were taught in school either. In fact, there's an interest in a narrative that wants to believe that this land was vacant. In fact, there's a book written by a young lady, and I forget her name. I want to compile this book list and make it available on the church website, or I can email it to you all. But the title of the book is "The Land Was Not Vacant." And basically, it pushes against this notion that the land was unoccupied, which is one thing that historically has been taught in schools. So if the land was not vacant, if there were upwards of 60 million people residing in native North America prior to 1492, where did they all live? Well, there were major metropolitan areas. In fact, I mentioned earlier Cahokia, just outside of East St. Louis, on the opposite side of the Mississippi River, up around St. Louis in present-day Cahokia, Illinois. Cahokia, when I was growing up in school, I can remember being taught in southeast Missouri that the people who built Cahokia, their descendants are no longer alive. That's what I was taught in school. And then I had my tribal elders who said, actually, it was our ancestors who built Cahokia. And, the conflict, and it took most historians a while to overcome the bias to say, okay, maybe people who lived in native North America in 1491 and even before were technologically advanced enough to build something like Cahokia. Here's why. Because in the year 1050 AD, Cahokia had a population of more than 20,000 people. Now, I know by today's standards that doesn't seem large because we have cities of 50, 100, even a million. But just to put that in perspective, London had a population of 15,000 at the time. And Rome, this massive capital, ancient capital, that at the time was at the very heart of the Holy Roman Empire, controlling most of Western Europe, only had a population of 30,000. And so we should think of Cahokia, which now, by the way, that's a picture of some of the ruins of Cahokia. We should think of it as being one of the large metropolitan centers, centers of trade, centers of commerce, centers of religion in North America in pre-Columbian times. What are some other centers of metropolitan communities? Chaco Canyon. Some of you have been to Chaco Canyon out west. Also Mesa Verde, Chichen Itza, and Poverty Point down in, I think, Louisiana, Mississippi. these are remains, and I remember hearing people talk about the Anasazi and a few other people who lived out west, and they said, "Oh, they died out, and their descendants are no longer with us." Well, that's not true. Native North Americans, indigenous people who are alive today, are descendants of the people who built these large metropolitan areas. But of course, in order to entertain that possibility, that continuity between those who built Cahokia, those who built Chaco Canyon, those who built Mesa Verde, and the native people today, that would beg the question, well, what happened to all the people? And that's one of the difficult lessons of history that we're going to wrestle with and struggle with. All right. Charles Mann, in his book 1491, which I commend to you all if you're interested in anything that I just mentioned, said this. He said, rather than the thick, unbroken, monumental snarl of trees imagined by Henry David Thoreau, the great eastern forest was an ecological kaleidoscope of garden plots, blackberry brambles, pine barrens, and spacious groves of chestnuts, hickory, and oak. So there is a term, spinoculture, is that it? Somebody Google that. Silviculture, thank you. Silviculture, which is the maintaining of forests so that they are inhabitable, so that they thrive and flourish and are actually kept maintained. Forests, by the way, maintained so that it contributes to the thriving of a people group. This is one way that I was talking to Bill earlier about burnings, the burnings out west. That was part of silviculture, as well as in the Upper East, along the eastern seaboard, the way that native communities took care of the woods. It was not just haphazard. It was by no means an untamed wilderness. Rather, it was a very intentional methodology, a complex technique of living with the land, not on it, that had been generated over thousands of years by the host peoples. Pardon? Silva, silviculture. Yeah. Did you look it up?
No, but it's on there.
Well, someone with Google can look it up and tell us exactly how it's spelled. Okay. Francis Jennings wrote another book describing what the country was like around the time of first contact. And this is what was said. European explorers and invaders discovered and inhabited land. Had it been a pristine wilderness, like some people alleged, then it would possibly still be so today. For neither the technology nor the social organization of Europe in the 16th and 17th centuries had the capacity to maintain of its own resources outpost colonies thousands of miles from home. Incapable of conquering true wilderness, the Europeans were highly competent in the skill of conquering other people, and that is what they did. They did not settle a virgin land. They invaded and displaced a resident population. Now, if that seems to be or sounds a bit harsh, just think, for instance, of the condition of England at the time of shortly after the time of the Columbian expedition. One thing that we know is that they had outgrown, many of their jails had been exceeded by prisoners. They had no place to accommodate them. In fact, at one point it got so bad that they were actually putting prisoners out on ships and putting them in the harbors. And one reason why that they had no way to accommodate these prisoners is because they had pretty much decimated their own landscape. Much of Western Europe, which at one time had been pristine oak forests, were exploited and decimated in order to build what? Castles, ships, naval fleets, and the list goes on. And so one reason why people began to look beyond the immediate horizon to what became known as the New World is because of the limited resources and the way that the land had become marred and exploited in Western Europe. Okay, so that brings us up to the point of contact or conquest, the year roughly 1492. So far, and I'll just back up a little bit and say, how long have, let's say, Cherokee people been in the Southeast? The estimates are at least 3,000 years. Some people would contend, well, let me just say this, that I'm part of a tribal group known as the Chickamauga Cherokee that have preserved the religion of the sacred fire. And the sacred fire purportedly was given to the Cherokee people at Katua in roughly 5,400 and some odd BC. And so when you think of those stories, which again, Cherokee people as well as most people in native North America were oral cultures. They were not cultures with a written history. And so it was very important to tell the stories correctly and to pass it down from one generation to the next. And when you think of the way that they had their own creation narrative, their own history, their own concept of how they came to be on the land that they were on, for most of them, let's just say conservatively, it was at minimum 3,000 to 4,000 years on what is now North America. There's a variety of stories that originate not only within certain southeastern tribes, but the Hopi as well they describe an event that happened in their distant past that anthropologists began to record, and they saw a lot of similarities between the event they described and what would have been known as the last ice age. Even among some of the Cherokee people that I know, some of the ancient writings of the Anikatani, which was a priestly class of the Chickamauga Cherokee people, or at the time just the Gatua Cherokee people prior to 1492, there were stories told of woolly mammoths being hunted. Just large animals. And so you think about the interaction between people who are indigenous to North America and some of the beasts and the animals that we've been able to explore through archaeology, and you realize, well, definitely it's a people group who've been here a very long period of time. So, conquest. How did it happen? If there was a group of people who were thriving, who were living in some degree of harmony prior to 1492, then how in the world did conquest take place? Well, Christopher Columbus made this comment. Made this comment about the peoples of North America and Central America. He said, these people are very simple as regards the use of arms or weapons. As your highnesses, he's talking to King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, will see from the 7 that I caused to be taken, he captured some and brought them to their court, to bring home and learn our language and to return. Unless your highnesses should order them all to be brought to Castile or to be kept as captives on the same island, for with 50 men they could all be subjugated and made to do what is required of them. So a people that he is describing is a very hospitable people, not a people that met him with arms and, ready to conquer and ready to go to war and ready to, perceived him as a threat. These were rather a hospitable people in so much that he felt like that 50 armed men could actually subjugate them. So that's the testimony of Christopher Columbus. So why in the world would Christopher Columbus want to subjugate and conquer a people group? Well, it goes back to what we call, what's been called, rather, the doctrine of discovery. This is not something that we have invented. It's something that is documented in history. And this is in 1492, and at the time, the only church was the Roman Catholic, or in the Western world at least, was the Roman Catholic Church. The Church of the Eastern world, the Greek Orthodox Church, was around, as well as the Church of the Global South in Egypt, the Coptic Church. But in the Western world, if you were Christian, you belonged to the Roman Catholic Church. It wasn't until the next century, the 1517, that the Reformation began and Protestantism became part of the Christian tapestry. But the doctrine of discovery, one cannot understand the motives behind the period of early American colonization apart from the critical ideology known as the doctrine of discovery. This belief, ingrained within the Western European world, considered all lands uninhabited by Euro-Christians as being at the disposal of the European monarchs, and at their discretion they could be claimed and sowed. So that's the ideological context that gave birth to the doctrine of discovery. So that when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, he had the blessing of the Pope and actually the mandate from the Pope that whatever lands he landed on, he could claim them for the crown of the Spanish king, because you may recall the Spanish king was Catholic, and he was a loyal defender of the church. So in 1452, this predates 1492 by 40 years. In 1452, there was the Dum Diversas, which is written by Pope Nicholas V. And in the Dum Diversas, he says this: "We grant you by these present documents, with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens," which is another word for Muslims, "and pagans, and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude." It is troubling, but yet true, that of the droves of missionaries that followed in the footsteps of Christopher Columbus in the years following the first contact, 1492, that most of the missionaries did not truly believe that that the native indigenous population had souls. In fact, it was one missionary in particular who stands out above the rest by the name of Bartholomew de las Casas, and he appeared before the court of King Ferdinand and actually said, "These are image bearers of God. They have souls. Therefore, let us send a mission to them in order to convert them to the faith." So just now, as Christians living in the 21st century America, the notion that any human being would be considered soulless or without a soul seems absurd. But when we think of conflicts that go on in our own day, perhaps it's not too far ideologically from some of our own preconceived ideas. Okay, let's talk about 1496, 4 years after 1492, when Christopher sailed the ocean blue and got lost at sea. In 1496, there was a patent that was granted to John Cabot and Sons. Now, this is moving from Spain to England, because what we'll see as the period of colonization progresses is that Spain becomes less of a force to be reckoned with, unless you're talking about Florida. The Spanish remained in Florida for quite some time. But by and large, Spain became less of a force to be reckoned with during the period of colonization, and England began to rise to the forefront. And so a patent was granted to John Cabot and Sons in 1496, and it states thus: "The king, to all whom come greeting, be it known and made manifest that we have given and granted to our well-beloved John Cabot full and free authority to sail to all parts, regions, and coasts, to find, discover, and investigate whatsoever islands, countries, regions, or provinces, which before this time were unknown to all Christians, and that John may conquer, occupy, and possess whatever such towns, castles, cities, and islands by them thus discovered, that they may be able to conquer, occupy, and possess whatsoever by them are discovered." So definitely there is this notion that the lands were ripe for the taking, and if you were a non-Christian, if you did not swear loyalty to any of the kings of Western Europe, Spain, England, France, Portugal, that your land could be claimed. And this will resurface again during the time of assimilation and annihilation, or near annihilation, attempted annihilation. Next week we'll talk, next Wednesday we'll talk more about that. But this concept, this notion of the doctrine of discovery, is really at the very bedrock of the American experience. And in order to come to grips with and develop a strong theology of place, which is answering the fundamental question, what difference does it make that I'm a follower of Jesus here, right now, at this time, in Soddy Daisy, Tennessee, or Red Bank, Tennessee, or Chattanooga, Tennessee, or wherever it is that you live? As you wrestle with that question of theology of place, you have to first ask the question, well, how did I get here? And what happened in order to make me getting here a possibility? And then the answers to these questions are at times unsettling, but I think they're very important answers, because in order for us to live as redemptive, restorative agents of Christ in this world, we have to find the truth, we have to find those answers, and we have to seek to address the wrongs that either we have suffered from or perhaps have been done in the name of Christ. And so this doctrine of discovery became the premise through which all of the conquistadors came to South America, all of the eventual Anglo settlers came to the shores, including the Puritans, came to the shores of North America, and it will reappear in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries in different guise. In the 15th and 16th century, by and large, it was known as the doctrine of discovery, that whatever land was discovered by a Christian monarch could be claimed for Christ, the church, and the crown. And the notion that that land may have been occupied by people for centuries before was completely annulled if those people were not Christian. And so, of course, for native North Americans and Central Americans and South Americans who had not heard the gospel, that was not the case. They were not believers, and so therefore the land was ripe for the picking, at least by the ideologies of Western Europe. So the doctrine of discovery has to be understood, has to be wrestled with, has to be dealt with if we're going to understand what is about to unfold, both in the age of colonization as well as in ensuing generations of American history. All right. Let's jump a little bit to the 19th century, the end of the 18th, let's jump to the beginning of the 18th century, which is roughly the 1700s, and in the beginning of the 19th century, and see how that the doctrine of discovery reemerged. It was no longer referred to as much as the doctrine of discovery. It took on a new term, the belief in American covenantalism. Now, what is American covenantalism? Well, it's all throughout puritanical, early colonial America. The notion that just as there were 13 colonies, so there were 12 tribes, 13 tribes of Israel, if you count Levi, and that just as the Israelites were given the promised land by God, so these 13 colonies were given the land of North America by God. Well, by implication, what has to happen to the inhabitants? They have to be driven out. And so there was a theological. Now, previously there was an ideological justification for conquering, for conquest. Now there became a theological justification for doing the same. By the way, this picture I got to see in person this year as we went to the Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. This is a statue. And if you can make it out, and I don't know that you can, but I believe it was displayed in the city of D.C., and then it was moved to the museum when it became obvious that it was rather offensive to some. Because what you see is a white man atop a horse, and he's leading. To the right is a African American, and to the left is a Native American. And they're walking, and the white man is riding a horse. And so if there's of course, people think and they dream and they express their values and they express their thoughts in their art. And so I think this art is an accurate depiction of the notion of American covenantalism. So American covenantalism is the belief that the founding fathers and the subsequent settlers had a God-ordained right to conquer and displace or replace the land's original inhabitants, from sea to shining sea. It persists as a dominant narrative in American history and is the philosophical justification for much, if not all, of American exceptionalism. How many presidential speeches have been made referring to the U.S. as a city on a hill, the light to the world? Jesus said that about his church, not about a country. Not about a people, not about a civilization, rather, but about his church, about his bride. But that language, loaded with theological meaning, became meaningful for a nation that saw themselves to some degree as the successors of the 12 tribes of Israel. If you think I make this up, well, let's listen to the Puritans. The idea of American covenantalism is something that was birthed out of the Protestant Reformation during a time of colonial expansion and thrived in colonial America. In 1620, just before the landing of the Mayflower, smallpox brought by English trading ships spread along the northeastern coast throughout the Pequot communities, resulting in massive deaths. King James, by the way, of historic fame because he commissioned one of the translations of the Bible, stated that the disease was, quote, God's great goodness and bounty towards us, the English. By 1640, the English settlers initiated a new attack on the Pequot communities. And this is a quote from William Bradford of Puritan fame. that William Bradford that's often celebrated at the time of Thanksgiving and that many of us have learned about in school. He said those Pequots that escaped, and this is referring to what happened once they came ashore and attacked some of the Pequot villages, those Pequots that escaped the fire were slain with the sword. Some hewed to pieces, others run through with their rapiers, so that they were quickly dispatched, and very few escaped. It was a fearful sight to see them thus frying in the fire, and the streams of blood quenching the same. And horrible was the stench and scent thereof. But the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and they gave the prayers thereof to God, who had wrought so wonderfully for them, and thus to enclose their enemies in their hand. American covenantalism, again, becomes part of the early colonial experience. 1630, aboard a ship bound for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, who was a Puritan preacher, preached a sermon in which he stated the following: He, God, shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all the people are upon us. Remember, he's not talking about the church. He's talking about a colony. The notion of American covenantalism became entwined with the American experience so that what was said historically about the church became true purportedly about the early American experience. And this is a quote from yours truly. One tragedy of the Euro-Christian myth created to justify the genocidal history of America is the manner in which the true Christ of Scripture has been and continues to be grossly misrepresented. So that characterizes the period, the age of conquest, the age of contact, when Columbus encounters America, and then finally the early Puritans when they come aboard. Now let's move quickly to the age of colonization. Mark Charles, who came here back, in August of 22, and he was doing a book tour, and I commend his book to you if you've not read it. It's entitled Unsettling Truths. He is a Navajo Anglo believer, and in this book he says this. He says the confusion of Old Testament Israel with the U.S. history becomes even more troubling with the trajectory of Deuteronomy and the historical narrative in the book of Joshua. In the cities of the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Completely destroy them. That's a quote from, of course, the book of Deuteronomy, taken out of context, being applied to, by way of implication, applied to the inhabitants of the New England coast. Okay, so let's look at the colonial population during the age of colonization. In 1650, there were roughly 49,368 settlers in the United States, in North America. Of course, this predates the United States, I realize that. But in North America, there were 49,368 settlers. By 1670, you can see that number doubled to 111,935. So that by 1770, a mere 80 years or a mere 120 years later, there were 2,148,076 settlers in North America. You say, okay, well, what impact did this have? Well, during this period of time, there was a war that was fought, known as the French and Indian War, between 1754 and 1763. It's more accurately known as the 7 Years' War because that's the duration of it. This war was fought between France and England, primarily over the French claims in the Ohio River Valley, so just west of the colonies prior to the Appalachian Mountains area, the Allegheny Mountains. The native population, they were wary of ever-expanding English settlers, so they sided with the French. The Treaty of Paris ended the war, relinquishing the contested territory to the British. resulting in Great Britain or England increasingly becoming the only player in the early colonial America. You can see here a map of the French claims, which are blue. Of course, anything beyond west of the Mississippi would later be part of the Louisiana Purchase under Thomas Jefferson. The red was the British claims. The yellow is the Spanish claims. At this point, the late 1600s, mid-1600s, relegated mainly to what is now Florida. The red and yellow were the disputed British-Spanish claims, and the red and blue were the disputed British and French claims. The 7 Years' War was concluded with the Treaty of Paris, which was signed in 1763. And in this treaty, France relinquished Canada to England. Spain relinquished Florida to England. England allowed France to keep its West Indian sugar islands, the Caribbean. And England allowed Spain to keep Florida. The Ohio Valley, which was that valley east of the Mississippi, between the Mississippi and the colonial boundary, was opened to English encroachment. But in 1763, King George at the time made a royal proclamation. This proclamation forbade all settlements west of a line drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, which was delineated as an Indian reserve. This exasperated colonial land speculators, which, by the way, we're going to talk more about land speculators in just a minute. But one of the reasons why the American Revolutionary War broke out was because of this line of demarcation. King George said, look, we're encroaching into Indian territory. Actually, King George was not an enemy to native people, to Indians. He, of course, was hated by the colonists for reasons that most of us are aware of. But one thing that exasperated the colonists is the line that was drawn along the Appalachian Mountains, to which he promised no encroachment would occur to the west of it. This contributed to the American War of Independence. Now, let me talk briefly about land speculation. What is land speculation? Land speculation was probably the most lucrative business during the colonial empire, during colonial America. Now, what is it? Well, in essence, think about it like this. Let's say that you have 40 acres. And I come and I look at your 40 acres and I say, Travis, I want to buy 10 acres. And you say, okay, I'll sell you 10 acres. And you think I want hunting rights, by the way. You think, what kind of absurd man would actually think he can buy land? Was he going to take it to his mother-in-law across the sea? No, you think, okay, he wants hunting rights. He wants farming rights. So, okay, I'll sell him the rights to the land. I'll give him permission if he wants to give me something for it. I say, okay, I want 10 of your 40 acres. Great. I want you to give me 20 head of cattle for the 10 of the 40 acres. All right? Or I'll give you, 20 head of cattle for 10 of the 40 acres. You say, okay. Well, I come the next week and I bring you 10 head of cattle. And then you never hear from me again. But instead, what I did was I took 12 acres, I drew it up on a map, I took it to my capital, and I went around to my friends and said, hey, I've got 12 acres of land, and this 12 acres of land is not worth a lot now, but it's going to be worth a lot in 10 years because look at our population. It's just bursting at the seams. Housing prices are going to skyrocket. This land, which is not worth a lot now, I gave 10 head of cattle for it. 10 head of cattle. I guarantee it's going to be worth 100 times that in 10 years. So all these people, they start saying, okay, I'll invest. Well, some of the people who were investing were members of Congress. Some of the people who invested, which I don't want to let the cat out of the bag, but does anyone know the occupation of George Washington? What was his occupation before the American Revolutionary War? Surveyor, farmer, what else? Why was he a surveyor? He was a stakeholder in land speculation. So the first president of the United States the depth of the investment was at the very top. All right. By the way, I commend this book to you as well. The book Speculation Nation, Land Mania in the Revolutionary American Republic by Michael Blackman. Excellent book about what land speculation was and how it affected not only the relationships between indigenous people of North America, but also actually contributed to the Revolutionary War itself. But he says this: speculation had been bound up with the English colonization of North America from the beginning, typically from tracts ranging from a few hundred acres to a few thousand. But beginning in the 1740s, prior to the Revolutionary War, sensing the steady growth of the colonial population, some elite colonists began projecting ways to profit off colonial expansion on a grander scale, founding a flurry of speculative land companies. By the mid-18th century, then, British Americans had developed a settler colonial system for dispossessing native people and apportioning their land into private property. After obtaining an Indian deed, colonists frequently failed to pay the price that they had promised, and some purchasers vaguely described the land they sought, swiftly surveying and patenting a much larger tract of land. So they would get people from Congress, they would get people from, or not Congress at this point in the 1740s, but they would get people who later became members of Congress, such as George Washington, who was the first president, and wealthy landowners, the elite in the colonies. They would get these people to invest in these speculative land claims. And guess what? One reason why that the settlers began to encroach further and further west of the demarcation line of 1763 was because they knew that they had support by the powers that be, the new republic. When the new republic became the United States of America, ultimately those who had invested in these speculative land claims were willing to send armies to back up their investment. And so we see the way that ultimately that the land was stolen from some of the tribes along the northeastern seaboard. Okay, speaking of our beloved General George Washington, in which, by the way, I had the privilege of being able to go to Mount Vernon. In fact, that's where I purchased the book that I quoted earlier, the book on land speculation, land mania during the early American Revolutionary period. But why did General George Washington at the time become so popular among the colonists? Because he understood something. He realized that in order for the early American experiment to be successful, the original inhabitants of the land had to disappear. And he said as much. This is a quote from George Washington. Speaking of one of the Indian villages, he said, "Lay waste all the settlements around, that the country may not be merely overrun, but destroyed. You will not by any means listen to any overtures of peace before the total ruin of their settlements is effected. Our future security will be in their inability to injure us, and in the terror with which the severity of the chastisement they receive will inspire them." So what are some of the characteristics of this period of early colonization? Well, there were frequent land skirmishes between settlers and tribes located along the eastern seaboard. Frequent land grabs against tribal villages conducted through a scorched earth means of warfare that we just read by General George Washington. Numerous disputes over land outside the proclamation line, which was claimed in violation of the treaties between England and native tribes. The more that the land speculators and the settlers encroached into the land west of the Proclamation Act, the demarcation line of the Proclamation Act of 1763, the more that the native tribes began to fight back. And they were by and large confused, and their confusion is expressed here in the words of the Powhatan leader who said, "Why should you take by force that from us which you can have by love? Why should you destroy us who have provided you with food? What can you get by war? You see us unarmed and willing to supply your wants. If you will come in a friendly manner and not with swords and guns as to invade an enemy." All right, well, King George, of course, made the colonists very unhappy. And so eventually we declared our independence from England. And we wanted King George to know that one of the reasons that we were upset is grievance number 27. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rules of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. Well, these skirmishes did not end, and so it ultimately led to the Treaty of Hopewell in 1785, where a new American republic recently declared its freedom from Great Britain, purchased that freedom with the bloodshed in the Revolutionary War, initiated this Treaty of Hopewell in 1785. And Article 5 of that treaty says, if any citizen of the United States or other person not being an Indian shall attempt to settle on any of the lands westward or southward of the said boundary, the Blue Ridge Mountains, which are hereby allotted to the Indians for their hunting grounds, or having already settled and will not remove from the same within 6 months after the ratifications of this treaty, such persons shall forfeit the protection of the United States, and the Indians may punish him or not as they please. And Article 13 of that Treaty of Hopewell said, the hatchet shall be buried forever. If only that were true. In 1788, a settler whom every Tennessean knows by the name of John Sevier, for whom Sevierville and Sevier County is named, who had previously in 1784 led a group of settlers from North Carolina to the west of the Blue Ridge Mountains, thus creating the independent state of Franklin, ordered an unprovoked, preempted attack on Cherokee towns, killing 30 villages. The federal government, who initiated the Hopewell Treaty that I previously read, refused to act, forcing the Cherokees to take matters into their own hands. And in the words of Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, who wrote a book similarly titled to our lecture, An Indigenous History of the United States, said, Sevier's actions formed a template for settler-federal relations, with the settlers implementing the federal government's final solution, while the federal government feigned an appearance of limiting settler invasions of indigenous lands. Why did they do this? Well, as I said earlier, many of them were having their bank accounts flushed with cash, with investments from land speculators. Land speculators that had speculated on land that was west of the demarcation line and even the line of the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Treaty of Hopewell. So what was the outcome? Another treaty, the Treaty of Holston, 1791. In this treaty, the Cherokee abandoned any claims to land on which the Franklin settlement sat. By the way, the Franklin settlement was illegal. It was west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a violation of the Hopewell Treaty, violation of the promise of King George, but at this point, England was no longer in the picture. Violation of the articles promising to bury the hatchet forever. The Cherokee abandoned the claim to land which was part of the Franklin settlement. The U.S. would pay the Cherokees $100,000, and Cherokees agreed to pursue civilization as defined by Euro-Christian settlers. And with that agreement began the official age of assimilation. However, that wasn't good enough. In 1793, Sevier invaded the Cherokee villages with a stated mission of total destruction. He demanded absolute submission from the remaining Cherokee villages, threatening to wipe them out for good. After waiting a month, in 1750, after waiting a month, 1,750 Franklin Rangers attacked 2 villages, burning the fields and houses to the ground. He wrote, "War will cost the United States much money and some lives, but it will destroy the existence of you Cherokee people as a nation forever." That's a quote taken from John Sevier, quoted by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States. That's where we'll bring our first lecture to a close. We covered a lot of territory. I know I probably introduced a lot of concepts and things that maybe you've never heard of. So why don't we do this? Why don't we take a 3-minute break and see if you need to go to the restroom or get something to drink or stretch your legs a little bit, and then we'll have a time of discussion. Okay? Why don't we take a 3-minute break? No, leave it running. We can always edit it later.